Heard him talking a lot about his private detective work on this movie. What do you make of it, Mark?
Well, as you know, I'm a huge fan of Riz Ahmed. It was a lovely interview. He described the film very eloquently there. As we know, it's directed by Pete Travis, an adaptation of a novel by Patrick Neate, who also wrote the screenplay. And essentially, as he was saying, it's an attempt on one hand to transpose the sort of hard-boiled noir detective fiction tropes into the sort of melting pot of modern-day London. He's a small-time private eye who runs this TA Confidential, it's called, is his office. One day, an escort comes in seeking his assistance, and this then leads him into a sort of labyrinthine web of intrigue, which involves the police, the feds, cricket, mullahs, property developers, drug dealers, old friends. It divides its time between two different time periods, going back into 1997. Story of him in his youth, as you said, being falling in love with his best friend.
Back in the old days of 97.
97, yeah. And somehow the past coming back to haunt him as he picks away at this new story. I think it's a very ambitious film. One of the things that's impressive about it is the kind of crepuscular London landscapes. It's all, reflected neon lights and, red and orange street lamps and strange green glows. A lot of lens flare. I mean, it looks
a lot of lens
flare. But actually, I thought that worked very well. I also think it's very good, and he was talking about this in the interview, about evoking that diverse culture and evoking a world in which there are, hundreds of different stories. I mean, the title, hints at it, City of Tiny Lights. There's all these different stories, all these different pasts, all these different histories, all intermingling. That was the stuff that I liked the best. There's a line early on in which his father said, "You've been boulder googly." And that's really the story of the plot, in the same way as something like...
And then helpfully explains a googly.
That helpfully explains a googly, yes. In the same way as a film like Long Good Friday, when the whole point is that it's all obfuscation, that in fact the real story that's going on is not the story that you're keeping your eye on. And I think it does owe a debt to that. And I think very few people could have pulled off the central role quite as well as Riz Ahmed does. I think he does brilliantly. And I think because you like him so much, because you find him engaging, you do get that sense that his character has a moral compass, despite the fact that, he appears to be living in what you described as a kind of, amoral world. That's all the positive stuff. I think that the problems are that sometimes the hard-boiled stuff doesn't ring true. I think sometimes the voiceover feels rather forced, rather too Philip Marlowe-ish.
They give up on the voiceover.
Yeah, they do. It kind of comes and goes. For as long as I remembered, she was all that mattered, but I had a murder to solve. Death's way heavier than a heartbreak. I mean, those sort of things I could have lived without them. And they also felt... Absolutely, as you say, it's kind of there and then it isn't, and then it's there and then it isn't. Voiceover is a very hard thing to get right, and it needs to have some kind of consistency. I didn't think that worked. And I thought there were times in the sort of latter third of it in which it felt like it had too many strands to deal with. But when it's working, when it's at its most successful, it's when it's actually really managing to conjure that idea that here is a character moving through this complicated world in which everybody has different stories and all these different cultures and ideas and themes, and you're not quite sure which is the one that you're meant to be following, and you're doing it in this sort of nighttime, noirish, as I said, neon lit, very seductive, but also sort of slightly strange world. It's not entirely successful, but I think there's enough about it that is, and I've said this so many times before, I would rather see a film that aims high and succeeds partially than a film that just takes the low road and just manages to get by on that. So, and if it had anybody other than Riz Ahmed in the central role, I think the supporting cast, incidentally, are all very solid. But if it had anybody less charismatic than him, I think it would have fallen apart. But as it is, I found it much more intriguing than perhaps sometimes the structure of it would suggest.
Yeah. I think there are moments when it becomes like it's a bit like an episode of Spooks, and I think that's
Spooks, okay,
less interesting. But you're right about Riz Ahmed. And do you remember when The Book Thief came out?
Yes.
When it's narrated by Death, and it's almost as though they give up on the narration, and then it comes up. What? Oh, it's
yes.
I remember that.
There's certainly a bit in this when the narration came in, and I'd forgotten that there was narration.
So, City of Tiny Lights is one of the releases.